Hello everybody, I'm back again to do a short lesson that will cover the end of the film we've just been discussing for the last couple of weeks, Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. This short class will also conclude Learning Unit 1 of English 1B, and we will move on to Learning Unit 2 next time. So consider this the last lesson you will have on the movie, and my goal today is briefly to cover the end of the film. The end of the film is really very important, I think, for unlocking the overall meaning of the movie, because what happens in the end is really spectacular, gruesome, and fascinating. And the question is why Tarantino would choose to end the movie this way. He offers us a revised history of an infamous and notorious murder, the murder of Sharon Tate, Hollywood movie star of the 1960s, and who's also a figure, although a kind of marginal figure in the movie he made about her murder. It's a revised history because this is the true story that he's been telling us. Well, that's kind of wrong, actually. He's been giving us a fictional story that circulates around a true event. And as the audience, we've been waiting for that true event to happen. And when finally it does, Quentin Tarantino gives us an alternate story, an alternate history, or a revised, a changed history of real events. So he takes the facts and he ignores them, turns them into events that did not actually happen. In order to understand why that's important, I encourage you to do some investigations of your own into exactly what did happen in real life. As I always say, Wikipedia is a bad place to quote from for your assignments, but a good place to start if you want to know the basic outline of any true story. Um, the murders were actually called the Tate LaBianca murders because they unfolded over 2 days, over August 9 and 10, 1969. We've just kind of had another anniversary for it, the 55th anniversary of these murders, I think. And what happened on the night of August 9th is that the actress Sharon Tate and a few of her friends staying with her in her house, Jay Sebring, who's also a character in the film, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski, along with another guy, Stephen Parent, were all murdered at the house in Cielo Drive where they were staying. And that really did happen. It was a true event. These murders were absolutely gruesome. They were carried out by a few members of the Charles Manson gang, but not by Charles Manson himself. In the movie, we see these characters who had been living on Spahn Ranch. Those were the Charles Manson family, and a few of them, including Tex, the guy on the horse, the cowboy on the horse, carried out these murders on the night of August 9th, 1969. It is the type of attack was a mass stabbing and a shooting, and altogether 7 people were murdered over the course of these 2 nights. Sharon Tate was 8.5 months pregnant when it happened, with the baby of her fiance, or maybe her husband at the time, Roman Polanski. So that added just a further gruesome twist detail to this whole very sick story. If you're a sensitive viewer, you would have really been pretty shocked by how Tarantino depicts his ending of the film. But I can tell you that the actual events of the story were way more horrifying than anything he actually showed us there. Again, if you don't like gore and horrible details, maybe look away now or fast forward through this part. But the actual events, which I think are important to understand because they explain why Tarantino does what he does. It's important to know this stuff. I'm not doing it because I'm a sick guy, but rather because this is useful to have in your head for the purpose of understanding the movie. But on the night during the attack, these people were stabbed and shot to death, and really also in just a horrific, evil, cruel way, were really tortured to death. Their deaths were not dignified or quiet. They were terrible, violent, and awful, and very painful for them, and deeply undignified. For example, in the house during the attack, Tate pleaded to be allowed to live long enough to give birth. She offered herself as a hostage to her killers in an attempt to save the life of an unborn child. But both Atkins and Watson, that's actually Tex Watson, two of the Manson family people, stabbed her 16 times, which is a lot of times to be stabbed. The coroner's inquest found that Tate was still alive, though, and while she was alive, they actually hanged her with a nylon rope from the ceiling of the house. And so the cause of her death was regarded to be a massive hemorrhage. She bled to death while she was hanging from this nylon rope around her neck. So that's just incredibly horrific. And it was intentionally horrific. As it says here, Manson wanted his charges to make it as bad as possible, to leave a sign, something witchy, something creepy, something awful. In Tarantino's version, the Manson family actually say this, we must make it witchy. We must make it look like it's a horrible, ritualistic killing, something to freak everybody out, to, destroy people's glamorized, idealized understanding of people like Sharon Tate, the Hollywood elite. Just absolutely wreck this whole thing. And what they did was to write pig on the front door in Tate's very own blood. There's a very famous picture in the weeks afterwards that emerged of Roman Polanski, that's him there, visiting the house where his wife was murdered, and he actually looks at the door on which the Manson family scrawled the word pig in his wife's own blood. At the time, it was regarded as a massacre. So a massacre means, just the kind of the worst sort of murder you can imagine. So that's important to understand as a concept, that this murder was a massacre, just gruesome, awful. It was actually designed by Manson to shock people, to make them afraid, and to destroy this Hollywood myth, the Hollywood legend, the Hollywood veneer of beauty, success, wealth, peace, ease, which, as I said in the last lecture, is kind of also part of the American Hollywood dream, the America that Hollywood projects out into the world as this idealized, heroic, glamorous, beautiful one. And it's like Charles Manson was trying to kill that because he hated it so much. What I think Tarantino is trying to do in his shocking ending is to restore some of that old school Hollywood glamour and myth-making potential that the movies have. It's almost like he's trying to bring it back by giving the story a new and actually happy ending, okay? By keeping, because what he does is he engineers the story so that Sharon Tate is never attacked. Cliff Booth and Rick Dalton are the ones who instead get attacked. They fend off the killers and they kill them instead in a very, very elaborate and extreme, almost satisfying, joyful way. They get revenge on Sharon Tate's, in this case, would-be murderers. So why does he basically tell the opposite story as to what's happening? And why is that in its own way quite shocking? It's shocking because of the extreme violence in the movie. And second of all, it's shocking because it goes against the narrative of what actually happened. But why does he change it? Let's think about that, okay, in the next few minutes. The way he makes it happen in the story, the way he engineers it, is that when the killers arrive on the night of August 9th to murder Sharon Tate on the orders of Charles Manson, they make a bit of a big noise in their clunky car, and it's heard by Rick Dalton, who has, so far been the actual protagonist of the movie. Cliff Booth is staying with him that night in his house, and he is just got off smoking a massive acid joint, so he's having like a really trippy experience in his own head. And these two are the ones who become the target of the Mansons instead, right? Because Rick Booth comes out of his house to shout at them to turn their car around and leave Sierra Drive because they're making a noise. No hippies are allowed on the private road, and so on. So they do turn around, and when they get to the bottom of the road, the hippies stop and they have a conversation, and they decide that instead of going after Sharon Tate, why don't we go after Rick Dalton instead? He just shouted at us, and he's that famous guy from all those dumb westerns, you know. He made all those stupid shows, and they all remember having watched the show as children. And one of the killers, whose name is Sadie, which she says at about the 2 hour 17-minute mark, she says, I watched Rick Dalton, I watched all those westerns, and those people in the films enacted a lot of violence on screen that was sanitized and just turned into entertainment. And her logic is that if you grew up watching that stuff, if you grew up watching TV in America in the 1950s, you also grew up watching murder. So let's kill the people who taught us how to kill. That's her logic. Let's instead go kill Rick Dalton because he makes movies in which he kills people. So let's give him his comeuppance. Let's inflict upon him what he has inflicted upon other people in the form of his TV shows. And let's take revenge on his brainwashing us into making us violent people. There's also maybe a little dig from Quentin Tarantino at his critics who say that his movies are so violent that they inspire violence. Here he's kind of turning that logic on them and showing us how ridiculous that claim actually is by putting it in the mouth of a drug-addled, sadistic, possible mass murderer. Okay, so that becomes their logic. Let's go kill Rick because Rick himself is a killer, even though he isn't. But kind of metaphorically, they think he is. That's their logic anyway. And so off they go into the house as a group. However, they make the massive mistake of first bumping into Cliff Booth, who's staying in a little house adjacent to Rick's. And what they don't know is that Cliff Booth and what we do know is that Cliff Booth is a very violent man himself. He's a war hero. He knows how to beat up Bruce Lee. He has a very dark past of his own. We covered this in the last class where I described him as being kind of your archetypal Western style hero. He's a bad dude with a good moral core, who knows how to do bad things to bad people in the name of a greater cause. Typical outlaw Western character. They bump into him. They all recognize each other from the Spahn Ranch thing. So here we have the movie tying up these loose ends, right? Somebody mentioned this in our last class, how the movie's very kind of all over the place. It's very kind of shaggy and lots of things, subplots going on. But now the subplots begin to merge, right? The killers recognize Rick, so they want to kill Rick instead of Sharon Tate. But they first encounter Cliff Booth, who knows them from Spahn Ranch. Therefore, he knows these people are bad dudes and that they've come to exactly the wrong place, and he's going to have to deal with them. And deal with them he does. What we have now is just an orgy of cinematic violence. So far, the movie hasn't had that much violence in it at all, which is unusual for a Tarantino movie. Usually they are super violent. But yeah, he's left it up all the way to the very end, and he gets as much kind of almost enjoyment from this as you possibly can as a movie maker. He really goes all in. It's super gruesome. There's lots of blood, there's gore, broken bones. The sound effects are intense. Very creative ways to kill characters, I suppose. The basically what happens is that Cliff Booth and Rick Dalton wipe out the whole Manson gang who have come upon them, and they do so by shooting them, stabbing them, smashing their faces into the floor, into the wall, into the telephone, into a marble tabletop in the kitchen. Um, they Brad Pitt sets his pit bull Brandy on all of them as well, and Brandy has a very delicious few snacks indeed because she hasn't been fed that night. And one of the characters, these characters are mauled, they're shot, stabbed, burnt. Then one of them, is sent flying out of a window in desperation, falls into the pool where Rick Dalton is listening to some music on a Walkman. And he makes the incredible decision to go fetch his movie prop slash real flamethrower from his tool shed, comes out with it strapped on his back, and proceeds to burn to death one of the Manson family killers. And all of them are left dead in the most gruesome, violent, and sadistic of fashions. So the real world event has instead been turned around and turned on them. And in a way, it's quite satisfying as a viewer because what you've seen is a kind of classic Hollywood movie trope, which is that good in this version has triumphed over evil. And it's also your classic Western ending where the good cowboys defeat the bad ones, even though they themselves are quite bad and use bad means to do so. They do it because it is in the name of a greater good, an unstated, undescribed greater good, but a good thing to do nonetheless. And so as an audience member, you're kind of invited into this alternate history, and it's a satisfying one. The violence is, for me, it's very off-putting. I just, it was so intense that I almost kind of find a slightly ethical or moral problem with it in kind of getting audiences to enjoy that violence. But maybe there's a way Tarantino is trying to make you reflect on the nature of violence as well, to make yourself wonder why it is actually that you got a bit of a kick out of it. Why do you enjoy that? What about the spectacle of violence is it that interests you so much that you carry on watching, even if you kind of watching from behind your fingers or from behind the couch or something, you're pulled in towards it. There's something about it that's a little enjoyable, glamorous, or something like that. So that's one side of it. But I think the bigger question is why is he allowed just to change history? History is recorded fact. This happened. If you're going to make a movie about what happened, okay, you have to take liberties and you have a bit of license to change things here and there around the margins. But he gives us a whole new ending completely in which Sharon Tate is spared and the bad guys are the ones who are murdered instead, right? That's very strange. Why does he do that? Why is he allowed to do that at all? Because in a way, isn't it kind of maybe a bit disrespectful to the victims, to the memory of the victims, to their living relatives, and an insult to history itself? You can ask those questions. That's absolutely fine. Those are good questions. But there's got to be some effect that he's going for. What is the effect? What is the thing he's trying to achieve? And there are many interpretations. You can have your own. You're welcome to your own. The one I'm going to offer you now is just merely my own opinion, I suppose. And it's linked to what I was saying in the last class, which is that Tarantino, throughout the film, he's always making these allusions to the old film genre of the Western. And I think what he's saying is that the Western is like the American fairy tale. After all, the movie is called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And Hollywood is the generator, the creator of all of our fairy tales, modern fairy tales. In this case, for Tarantino, it's the Western that best embodies the modern fairy tale. It's the allegory. It's a thing that contains our values. It contains an explanation for how the world works and how ideally the world should work. It's kind of like a moral map or something like that, a way for us to understand how we should behave in a dangerous, complicated world. And so in my view, what he's trying to do is recreate the Western as a fairy tale for modern life by going back in time and changing events that led to the the kind of falling away of the glamorous old Hollywood as it was, right? That murder really, like I said earlier, destroyed the myth of Hollywood in a sense. It besmirched it, it sullied it. And what I think Tarantino is trying to do is give us a new meaning for that event by couching it in a new fairy tale. A fairy tale is a thing, a larger social narrative that gets adopted to be the direction or course that human beings now think along instead. Okay. So to put that another way, or to kind of re-explain it maybe more clearly, is that he's going back, restoring the. You see, it's kind of can be a little bit hard to explain, I guess, but he's trying to give us a new meaning to that event because the old meaning is so dark and unpleasant, and so in a way, and is something that led to the destruction of something good and something useful. It's his attempt to go back and restore it to something that means a good moral thing again, right? To give us a brand new fairy tale, to replace the darkness, the gruesomeness, the horror of the real with the beauty of the unreal, so that we can kind of have our faith restored in the idea of a fairy tale, right? So if that's all true, you got to think about what the implications are for how human beings live in the world. And I think the reason why I'm kind of going in this direction is because of this very interesting final 90 seconds or so of the film. There's a very illuminating little chat between Rick and Jay, where Rick Dalton's kind of just seen the cops and the ambulances take off, and he turns around, and standing behind the gate of Sharon Tate's property is Jay Sebring, who's one of Sharon Tate's friends, her ex-boyfriend, and one of the people who would have been killed that night in the real world. And they have a very interesting little chat, in which you see, like, what happens is Rick explains to Jay what happened, and Rick says something like, I came out and I roasted her with a flamethrower that I just happened to have in my tool shed. And Jay replies, "Oh, the flamethrower from the movie you were in." And Rick's like, "Oh, yeah, yes, that's exactly the one. You know my movies?" And he's like, "Yeah, I know your movies. And Sharon Tate, she loves your movies. She's always talking about you. She knows who you are." And this, like, it just lights up Rick. He's so happy to be known by somebody else famous and to be appreciated. But also what's going on is that the props from his movie become real life objects that have a real world impact in the actual world. The flamethrower becomes something that kind of saves Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring. They don't know it, of course. They don't know they would have been murdered. But the fictional, the unreal becomes the real. And there's now this kind of very almost natural exchange between the world of the unreal and the world of the real, between what did and what did, right? So you have this interesting dynamic going on by the end of the film, where the made up stuff has become more powerful than what actually happened, than reality. And that for me is sort of Tarantino's overall intention or meaning that he's trying to create in the film, which is, I'm going to take this form of the Western, which is no longer something really people use. It's an old, dead form of storytelling. And I'm going to breathe new life into it by changing the very same events that led to the death of Hollywood and people's faith in it, and turn it into a new fairy tale, a new social story that people can start believing in instead of what actually happened. So he's like trying to change the meaning of Sharon Tate's murder into something else. Now, whether or not he actually pulls that off, who knows? But it is an interesting statement about what he thinks is the power of film and what role it plays. It's not just entertainment. It's not just movies to distract us or to shock us or just be a kind of superficial spectacle. He's not trying to make a movie like Iron Man or Marvel movies and all the rest of it that you just eat popcorn in front of and enjoy like it's a sugary treat. Tarantino's movies want to also say something. They want to be a commentary. They want to have a purpose or a meaning of their own that people can have in their head and take out with them into the world. Because for him, as I've said many times before, as I say in the slide above, Tarantino learned kind of all he knows in life from films. Films are the thing that, in a way, create reality. Okay, just like fairy tales create meaning and wisdom and are things we pass down through the generations. So films are our modern day fairy tales. And we need to create films that, in his telling anyway, we need to create films that function like fairy tales do. They give us some kind of a meaning to events, even if those movies are unreal, they're fictional, they're allegorical, metaphorical. There's a way that we can maybe understand them to be almost quote unquote better than reality. And that's kind of what I think he's driving at. There's other interpretations you can have. You are welcome to think that what I've just said is all a load of claptrap and nonsense, and it could well be. But there are innumerable ways to understand a film like this. One last thing, and then I'll wrap it up. I'm going to ask you to just think about this as a question. I won't explain it right now, but there is a required reading you have to use by Saris, which goes into detail about what an auteur is. I've spoken a bit about what an auteur is. And the question is whether or not this is the work of an auteur. Is Tarantino an auteur? There are three elements of being an auteur that Saris defines. So go read that article, please. Look for the three things, and then think about whether or not you believe that by the end of the film, Tarantino has created a piece of cinema that is the work of an authentic auteur. And I will leave it there. This will now conclude Learning Unit 1. We will therefore move on to Learning Unit 2. Our next live class will be an introduction to the work of Angela Carter, and we will look at the first prescribed story, which will be The Snow Child. It's a very short story she wrote. I'll explain more on that later, but make sure you are familiar with her work and please have read The Snow Child. I've put an audiobook link on the playlist of required videos you should watch on YouTube, so you can listen to it as an audiobook. It's literally 2 or 3 minutes long. It's a very short one. Okay, guys, I'll chat to you again. Until then, do stay well and goodbye.